Hey everybody, and welcome. I can't really welcome you. This is a bit more of a somber occasion than that, but thank you also very much for being here. I need to get that out of the way. We're also having a few minor technical issues here. Blog Talk Radio, for those of you who don't know, has been kind of monkeying with their setup and so forth at the moment, and that creates complications as people try to call in, figure out the way around the new features, and so on and so forth. So we're working on getting everybody in and lined up. I'm Robert Winfree. I forgot to mention that. This is going to be a tribute podcast to Wes Craven, one of the true masters of horror who passed away on Sunday. And the reason that I chose the opening music that I did, I consulted with a few of my friends, and it occurred to me that Benjamin Cologne, who should be joining us shortly here, that's a legal disclaimer, so for those of you tuning in specifically to hear Ben, if he doesn't call in, I'm not guaranteeing it. That was the plan. That's not in stone or anything. Now, again, we went with that song because, as it turns out, and I realized, Ben pointed this out, and I realized it, that during the last year, I believe, or you can find this in the archives, on the Long Road to Ruin, I hosted a two-part retrospective of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. It's a very large franchise. Myself, Benjamin Cologne, and Sean Comer, who I believe was also kind of planning on jumping in here when he gets some free time, spent 2 whole episodes. It was over 5 hours, I think, of total airtime. I mean, we talked about those movies a lot because there's a lot to talk about. But it turns out that we completely neglected, when discussing Dream Warriors, to actually talk about the song from Dawkins. So that's why we opened with it. I feel so silly about that we somehow managed to miss it. Again, one of those, it should have been so obvious, and yet somehow we managed to miss it. But we're all going to get here, and Benjamin Cologne is in queue right now. I'm going to unmute him in a second. Again, Sean will be on when he gets the chance to, assuming he does, and he's not too busy, because Sean's a busy guy. And we're just going to kind of talk and reminisce about Wes Craven, his career, his legacy, all that good stuff. So, Ben, I noticed that you've got Skype working for you again, so let's all cheer Blog Talk for making a smart decision to reinstate that. How you doing this evening?
Hey, how's it going? I'm doing okay. I almost didn't make it on time.
I appreciate it. I'd hate to be here by myself for an hour, because
and for the
alone man. Good.
For the record, nobody's tuning in just to hear me. Let's just get that out of the way.
You never know. I have to cover all my bases legally. I don't need people yelling at me any more than they already do.
Sure.
All right. Well, we're going to be retreading a little bit of ground here, but I need to ask this because I'm not sure. I can't remember off the top of my head. You do a lot of the of the convention circuits, Comic Cons, things of that nature. So, have you personally ever had the chance to meet Wes Craven at any of those events you've been to? I can't remember off the top of my head if that's been something that you've done or not, or that I'm aware of. So have you ever had that opportunity?
Unfortunately, no. That would be really really cool. That would be pretty high up there. There so happens to be another Chiller Theater convention. They do it twice a year, coming up this October, and so far the guest list has actually been pretty lame considering it's the 25th anniversary. But I was hoping for somebody big, and I was hoping for somebody along those lines, like Wes Craven or Clive Barker or even Robert Englund, somebody like that. But I haven't had the pleasure of being able to meet Wes Craven. That would have been pretty cool. But I guess we're here to give what amounts to Blog Talk's and Radulich and Broadcasting Network's eulogy for Mr. Craven.
Something along those lines. I try to keep these things lighter and positive as opposed to down and depressing. I actually hosted the one we did on Roddy Piper after he passed away. And thankfully, again, we managed to avoid, being too down in the doldrums.
Yeah, man. What a year it's been, man.
It has. I was talking with Sean about that the other day. Like, man, this year really sucks.
Yeah. I mean, whatever you care to name that you happen to be a fan of, we lost an icon or two or maybe even three.
Yeah, it's been rough, and we've still got a few months to go, and I have a slightly more positive thought I want to share at the end that kind of pertains to that. But yeah, it's been a rough year, so I'm curious for you. You're a creative guy. For those of you who don't know what Ben does, he, among other things, writes, draws, self-publishes not a webcomic, but a comic called Soul Exodus, which you can find at soulexo.com. I'm getting good at integrating these plugs. I'll get it down one of these. I'll get it smooth one of these days. But he does that, and does a lot of other artwork, does some writing as well. As a creative person, and more importantly, as a big horror fan, I know, again, you and I and Sean spent 5 or 6 hours talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and the importance of Wes Craven to that franchise's success, and we talked about him at length on the Scream podcast series as well, also on The Long Road to Ruin. More cheap plugs. So I'm just for you as a creative person, what are some of your favorite kind of memories, and do you have a particular style or things that you think he is again a creative entity? He was a writer, a director, a producer. He had his hand in a lot of different things when it came to the creative aspect. Do you think he's influenced you personally, and do you have any specific examples of that?
I'm sure as we go along, I'll probably come up with a few specific examples. I maybe more subconsciously than anything else, there's no way that Wes Craven has not influenced me creatively. I grew up on horror flicks and namely Nightmare on Elm Street. And even some of Wes Craven's kind of fun and entertaining lesser known movies throughout, sprinkled in between the Elm Streets and the Screams throughout the 80s and 90s. Me personally, I'm a horror guy. And Wes Craven was when he was at his best, he was one of those guys that actually, very much like a lot of my horror idols, like Stephen King and like Clive Barker. These are creative people who tried to dig deep and tried to not just show you things that scared you, but they were very interested in why they scared you and what made them scary and the psychology of that. And Nightmare on Elm Street, in particular, Wes Craven's own personal fears and his observation of other people's fears of dreams and sleeping, and he managed to kind of spin that into this sprawling boogeyman tale. I've written some scary stuff before, and some maybe surrealist or some some farther out stuff that might be considered reminiscent of something Wes Craven might do. As far as influence, yeah, there's no way I could say he hasn't.
You mentioned Freddy Krueger, and again, there have been quite a few discussions of that character in general. Something that Sean brought up and that was reinforced after watching. Here's another pseudo plug for you, because again, if you haven't listened to the two-part that Sean, Ben, and I did on the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise on the Long Road to Ruin, please look it up. I know the three of us had a lot of fun with that series, and but we reference a lot the documentary called Never Sleep Again, which is a nearly 4-hour video documentary about the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, behind the scenes stuff. I think it still streams on Netflix. It's still an awesome listen, awesome view. And Wes talks about the creation of Freddy Krueger specifically, and he's wearing. For those of you who don't know what Freddy Krueger looks like, first of all, I can't help you as far as how far your head is buried under the sand, because it's Freddy Krueger, for crying out loud. But his decision to have him wear on his upper body a long-sleeved, horizontally striped red and green sweater was chosen very specifically because red and green are two of the most jarring colors to the human psyche when put next to each other, and horizontal lines are unsettling. They distort us kind of visually as opposed to vertical lines. And it's just, it's a level of detail and a level of thoughtfulness put into creating something that I guess you just don't see all that much anymore. And that's one of the things that kind of strikes me with Wes Craven about the stuff that he's really involved with, and it's very thoughtful. It's very intelligently put together, and I'm not saying his stuff is again the most thoughtful, thought-provoking films ever committed to celluloid, but he puts a lot of thought into what he does. Nothing he puts on screen is random or haphazard or put together by happenstance. He makes a lot of very conscious, very detail-oriented decisions that go into it, and it's one of the reasons he's so successful. Because again, he's willing to look at how can I best unsettle people visually with a guy who's going to be burned over the entirety of his face and wield a evil-looking claw, but how can I still unsettle them more than just, hey, look, it's a scary-looking guy? They're doing things that mess with you, almost unconsciously, and that's a degree of again detail-oriented filmmaking that is I don't see it all that much anymore, and I tend to see a fair amount of movies, and it's kind of lost, and I think that's a very sad thing. Now, you specifically mentioned to me that you wanted to talk about, I believe you not threatened me, but you told me specifically, don't talk about Deadly Friend without you here on the show, and that's one of his earlier movies that came out in 1986. This was after A Nightmare on Elm Street, the second Hills Have Eyes movie. So I'm curious, what was it about this one? Go ahead.
Yeah, this was actually Wes Craven's follow-up to Nightmare on Elm Street. This was the movie he made immediately after. Deadly Friend, not the greatest movie in the world, not even necessarily the greatest follow-up movie in the world to something as good and as groundbreaking and as iconic as Nightmare on Elm Street. But I remember this movie very well. I don't know, have you seen it before? Have you ever seen it before?
I actually haven't seen this one. I hadn't even heard of it until you mentioned it specifically, so now I get to find it either on Netflix or I'll start browsing my local, dollar DVD bins and see if I can locate it. But I hadn't seen it before.
You may have better luck in the dollar bins. I don't know off the top of my head if it's on Netflix. It's a relatively obscure movie, even though it was Wes Craven's follow-up to Nightmare on Elm Street. But basically, the premise is it stars actually a very young Christy Swanson, and she is sort of the girl next door to this boy genius computer inventor who has developed this artificial intelligence chip that he puts in this robot that basically gives autonomy to this robot that he built. Christy Swanson's character actually is killed after they meet up and they kind of hit it off, and she's actually killed at, I can't remember if it's in a car accident or something like that. I honestly really wish I had a chance to watch it again before we did this, but in his grief and to push, I guess, somewhat of a Frankenstein allegory, however much of it may exist in this case, the boy actually implants the AI chip into her brain and brings her back to life, but now she's basically an android, more or less, or basically just a human body with a computer brain. And of course, as these things tend to happen, she goes nuts and starts killing people.
That's what artificial intelligence does. At least that's what every book or movie on the subject has taught me.
Sure. I can't remember if I know there's an abusive jerk father. I can't remember if it's hers or if it's the boy's. But
Wikipedia tells me that she achieved brain dead status after her father shoved her down the stairs.
Oh, is that what it was? Damn it.
Hey, it's the internet, so I'm not sure how accurate it is, but that's the information I have at my disposal.
Sure. But, he meets his demise. I think he gets roasted to a crisp in a furnace of some kind. And here's the thing that anybody that has seen this movie, whether they know it or not, if you've seen this movie, if you don't remember anything else about it, you will remember this part. And that is the crotchety old lady across the street or next door, played by Anne Ramsey from The Goonies and from Throw Mama from the Train, Ma Freddy herself, who I think, after anybody that has seen The Goonies as a kid, wanted her to die in some horrible way anyway.
Guilty.
Sure. And what happens is there's a scene in this movie where she is basically decapitated by a basketball. Christy Swanson's character, after gaining, artificial intelligence from this computer, apparently also gains superhuman Terminator strength. And there's this running, little subplot where the old lady is, she keeps any, football, basketball, frisbee, or whatever that finds its way into their yard. Well, Christy Swanson's character goes to retrieve it. The old lady standing in her way. She removes the old lady from her way, head first. It is the most hilariously... At first, it's actually not a bad effect, because you see her hurl a basketball at this old lady, and her head explodes like a melon, and you see every bit of it. And then the headless corpse kind of goes into these death convulsions, but it's so ridiculous and it's such a piss poor effect that you can actually see, the person underneath the headless dummy kind of moving sideways, like her hip bone has gained sentience before, hitting the ground. If you watch this movie for no other reason, watch it for that. And this is Wes Craven. That was Wes Craven's follow-up to Nightmare on Elm Street. I couldn't make that up if I tried.
Oh, you couldn't. I might have to watch it now. I will now find it just for that particular sequence, if nothing else.
Up until that point, the movie's okay. It's, it's not terrible. after that scene, it's mostly forgettable. It actually has a pretty decent creepy ending, which in some ways makes absolutely no sense, but I don't want to spoil it too much. But that scene kind of launched that movie into obscure cult movie lore because it's the villain from the Goonies and she gets decapitated by a basketball. Where else are you gonna see something like that?
No, you've sold me on it. I'll find it now. I'll make the concentrated effort to locate a copy that I can buy. And hey, I'll freely admit I'll do my best to avoid nefarious means when it comes to this one. But if I have to find that particular sequence online, I will. So
it's on YouTube.
Yeah, you've sold me on it.
It's at the very least that one scene is on YouTube. So if you're curious just about that, then knock yourself out.
As soon as we're done here.
I'd recommend checking out the movie. It's pretty good. It's not Nightmare on Elm Street good, but it's pretty good and it's fun. And I guess that can segue. A lot of Wes Craven's movies, even if they weren't 100% on the level of Nightmare on Elm Street, you can say at the very least they were entertaining. They were fun. I remember. I also remember another kind of overlooked Wes Craven movie is the People Under the Stairs.
That's a creepy one.
It's creepy.
If you want to scare the crap out of children, that's a good one.
It's creepy, but it's also played in some parts almost like black comedy, from what I remember. And it's been a while. It's another one that's been a while. My other familiarity, like my other association with that movie is that I lived, in the 90s, I lived in Florida, very close to Orlando, Florida, as a kid and teenager. Universal Studios in Orlando, Florida had what's called Halloween Horror Nights. They do, the last week or two in October leading up to Halloween, they convert the entire theme park into a series of haunted houses and Halloween and creepy, scary themed rides and attractions. One of them was themed after the People Under the Stairs. It scared the living hell out of me, and I, mind you, I'm about 12 or 13 at the time. It's one of the creepier haunted houses I've ever been to, so that's also my association with that. I'd almost dare say it was creepier than the movie.
Entirely possible. When you get to a good haunted house like that is a kind of an experience unto itself, and they can be a lot of fun. As far as I kind of want to segue because and talk a little bit about this because we've touched on Wes. Even his movies that are not, again, even the ones that aren't necessarily all that critically successful. The number of times I've watched a Wes Craven movie and not, at the very least, been entertained is extraordinarily low. I didn't think too much of, and he just produced this one, but the movie They, not a big fan of, and I thought My Soul to Take was extraordinarily weak. But other than that, I tend to, at the very least, enjoy it, and he's responsible for a couple of substantial booms in the horror genre. I mean, this doesn't get brought up a whole lot, unless guys like you and I are, and we just sit around and kind of talk about crap like this, but, Freddy Krueger in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which came out, again, the original Nightmare on Elm Street came out in '84, it really kind of revamped, it breathed new life into the slasher genre in a lot of ways. I mean, at that point we were on, we were a couple of Halloween movies deep. I forget precisely which, Friday the 13th we were on at that point, but we're well past 2. 4.
I'm almost positive it's 4. The final chapter, the absolute final chapter, for real.
Oh yeah. Final chapter, except here comes, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, remake again. The status of those things aside. But we got a character that in Freddy Krueger who was very, very different from the traditional slasher villain to this point. To this point, they were generally not completely voiceless or faceless. I mean, again, you have Michael Myers in the clown mask and Jason famously in the hockey mask. But the slasher villain was presented as just kind of a... Again, it was more about inventive kills than it was interesting characters. And with The Nightmare on Elm Street, Wes completely turned that on its ear. And, I mean, Freddy Krueger became a pop culture phenomenon unto himself, and to both good and ill, by and large, as again has been discussed at length here on various podcasts. But again, you go from the silent, unkillable force of nature that is Jason Voorhees to Freddy Krueger, who is physically very different, kills very different. I mean, again, Jason is real and can't die. Freddy Krueger is completely within your own mind. I mean, they couldn't be more different, by and large. And that, again, created a wave of resurgence in slasher genres and the horror genre specifically. Then, in the the late 90s, when the mid 90s, the horror genre was in a really bad way. And I have to recommend listening to The Long Road to Ruin on the Scream franchise that I was also a part of. Yay for more cheap plugs. But the opening to that particular podcast contains a discussion with me, Mark Radlich, and Sean Comer about where horror was, again, pre-96, pre-Scream. And it was a bad, bad place. And then Wes Craven decides that he's going to change he's going to single-handedly almost create a new wave of interest in horror movies and completely revitalizes the entire genre from Hollywood's perspective at the very least. And I mean, it's phenomenal to consider that over a decade after he did it once, he did it again. When we talk about masters of horror, there's a reason this guy's name keeps popping up, because not a lot of people are even remotely capable of doing what he does when he's on his game. I mean, I can't imagine the state of cinematic horror without Wes Craven. And I can't say that about too many people. There's a few, but I mean, just without him, imagine what we don't have. It's a little bit insane to consider that basically one man did all that.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of add a little bit to what you were going for here. And I think a lot of that can be credited to Wes Craven he was a guy that took chances, and he made a lot of unconventional choices with in regards to casting and in regards to the way he sort of told his stories. And I think it's been said about the casting of Robert Englund and how you can call it maybe there was a little bit of luck involved, but I'd like to think that there was a lot of vision involved in that too, because Robert Englund, if you put yourself in the mindset of somebody who's trying to make a horror movie and trying to make a slasher movie in around 1983, which was probably when the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie was made, if you're trying to come up with a convincing and an intimidating horror movie villain, somebody who presumably, Robert Englund was around in his mid-30s at the time. His background is in stage acting, which means, and if you've ever seen a play live, if you've ever seen any kind of stage production, stage actors rely very heavily on body language, where facial expression may fail them due to having to convey a performance to people who may be too far away to pick up on subtle, expressions of the face and eyes and things like that. Stage actors tend to act a lot with their bodies. So Robert Englund was somebody who was very, very familiar with the concept of creating body language to enhance character. And that and he lent a lot of that to Freddy Krueger. I like to think that was intentional on Wes Craven's part, that he wanted to create a unique kind of villain, because like I said, if you put yourself in the mindset of somebody trying to create a slasher movie villain during that time, your prototype for that is you've got maybe one or two Friday the 13th movies that featured Jason Voorhees. You've got Halloween. You've got Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where these are all, if not huge, hulking, silent brutes, they're at least silent brutes, which Freddy is not either of those things. He kind of broke the mold. He was, he was kind of one of a kind, in that genre, and that's probably, that can certainly be attributed to why he's endured for so long, is because there, at the time there was nothing quite like him. The total package of Robert Englund's performance, and then Craven's direction, and then the effects work, and just the ingenuity of the storytelling. And then, like you said, he did it again in Scream with some unconventional choices, which a lot was made in the first Scream movie, and I hope I'm not spoiling this near 20-year-old movie for anybody, but the casting and sort of the putting Drew Barrymore up front as, and I'm sure you guys mentioned this in the show previously, but putting Drew Barrymore up front as basically the star of the movie who gets killed before the opening credits start rolling. Basically playing, the Janet Leigh role in Psycho, but it was something that hadn't been done quite like that since then. So we're talking, almost 35, 40 years, to revisit a very, unconventional storytelling, very unconventional storytelling choice in and of itself, the way Hitchcock did it in Psycho. Wes Craven kind of reinvented it and presented it in Scream in that way, and then you're kind of off to the races. Now you don't know who's safe, you don't know who's going to make it out alive. It's kind of, all bets are off after that. That's kind of one thing I felt made the first Scream. And you can say what you want about the sequels. I don't care as much for the sequels as I do for the original, but the first Scream I considered to be pretty unpredictable, and pleasantly so.
I would completely agree with you as far as that goes. And again, the sequels have their ups and downs. I'm not and Wes Craven directed all of them. I'm not a huge fan of the second Scream. I think it was far too rushed, and I think that is very apparent. And 3 is fraught with problems. 4 at least somewhat returns to kind of the appropriate traditions of the original, in a nutshell, my opinion. But yeah, I mean, again, Drew Barrymore was kind of a big deal in. If those of you who don't remember, or were a bit, were young in 1996 when the first Scream came out, Drew Barrymore was kind of a big deal. She was promoted heavily on the posters. I mean, that's her face front and center on the the iconic poster. It's her eyes with Scream written under it, and then everyone else kind of. And she dies in the first 10 minutes, violently. And again, I apologize. Like Ben, the movie's almost 20 years old. I will not entertain the notion of spoiling something that old. That's on you guys at this point. And it's again, it's a little bit crazy to kind of consider how influential Wes Craven was, and like you mentioned, the detail and the choices that he makes. I mean, in contemporary filmmaking, the notion of meta films, and insert your air quotes around meta, that whole thing starts with Wes Craven. I mean, again, you can I suppose we can debate, film historians and whatnot. Much like where does found footage start, where does the slasher genre start? There are debatable points, but the notion of meta filmmaking, self-referential, self-aware filmmaking, and movies that fall into that, I think that starts and ends basically with Wes Craven. He started with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, the probably the best, objectively speaking, as far as scary sequels to the original Nightmare on Elm Street go, and Sean Comer has made that particular case much more eloquently than I can. So if you've not heard him make that pitch, I'd encourage you to look it up. And then a lot of the meta references that he started with in New Nightmare become full bore in the Scream franchise, where Jamie Kennedy actually discusses the rules of horror, how to survive them. You have interesting kills in the first Scream movie. I mean, again, Drew Barrymore dies very quickly. Rose McGowan is, I can't say decapitated or even bifurcated, but she is crushed while trying to escape a garage door. And in one of my favorite kills of that entire franchise, you get to watch Matthew Lillard die, and that's always a plus. He went so far as to cast Skeet Ulrich specifically because he physically resembled Johnny Depp, to kind of further, the reference to the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which again, the first Nightmare on Elm Street is Johnny Depp's first major movie role, and much as I love Wes Craven, I'm not sure I can ever quite forgive him for that one, because now we have more Johnny Depp, and it's boy, is that hit or miss.
Hey, that Whitey Bulger movie looks like it's going to be pretty good. Hopefully it will be.
And you'll get this. I mentioned this to someone else, and it went right over their head, but it looks like they put a lot of time and effort into making Johnny Depp look like Brad Dourif, right? Couldn't they have just hired Brad Dourif?
Now I'm going to have to go back and look.
That was the first time I saw the trailer for Black Mass, which is a biopic about Whitey Bulger, who ran the Irish mob in Boston, for those of you who don't know. It's a forthcoming movie. And it does look pretty good, but I saw it and I thought, hey, is that Brad Dourif? And no, wait, Black Mass, okay, that's Johnny Depp. They just made him look like kind of contemporary Brad Dourif, and I just went, couldn't you just... Why are you going to make Johnny Depp sit in makeup for 3 hours to make him look like someone who already exists? Another actor who you probably could have hired.
Well, they would otherwise have to wait another 30 or 40 years for him to maybe age slightly more. Probably not, so,
That's very true. Man, Brad Dourif. That guy can be creepy. For those of you who don't know, just real briefly, Brad Dourif is most known for the voice of Chucky from the Child's Play franchise. And he's done a lot. Honestly, the thing I most remember him for from a live action perspective is there's an episode of season 8 or 9 of Criminal Minds, I can't remember which one, that features him turning people into human marionettes. And that guy is scary when he wants to be. I'll just leave it at that.
I'd also recommend Exorcist 3. He's in that, and he's really creepy in that, too.
Oh, yeah. Exorcist 3 has probably the best jump scare in horror movie history. To kind of put an end to that particular, as Jason Teasley calls them, rabbit holes, sidebars. I'm curious, you personally, again, kind of gun to your head, do you have a favorite Wes Craven movie, television show that he's been a part of or whatnot that, and kind of passing over the big ones, do you have maybe an overlooked classic of his, something that you want to bring up here that you think might not get enough attention in other forums that are going to discuss Wes Craven in the wake of his passing?
It's been so long since I've seen some of them. I know he directed the ill-fated Swamp Thing movie in '82, like pre-Nightmare on Elm Street.
That's not a bad movie. I'm not gonna lie. I've seen that. It came out in 1982. It's not bad. You can see kind of parts of what's gonna. Again, Swamp Thing is actually a very interesting character for those of you familiar with his source material. If you're a child of the 80s like I am, you might remember kind of the ill-fated and heavily children-advertised cartoons that he was a part of that did the character
Right.
absolutely no justice. But no, that's not a bad one. There are some real moments in that movie that are pretty darn good. Overall, it suffers a bit.
If I don't know, aside from the big and well known and well covered ones, like I said, I remember the ones that are, I remember the ones that are not as good but still relatively entertaining. We haven't talked about Shocker yet, also because I haven't brushed up on that one, but I remember that one being pretty batshit insane too.
I'm a sucker for Mitch Pileggi, so I'll see a lot of the stuff that he's involved in. He's one of my, he's one of those working actors that I've got kind of a soft spot for, probably because I grew up on the X-Files and again, so as another random association. But no, Shocker is a little bit crazy. I'm curious. Have you seen Red Eye, and do you have any thoughts on that one? Because I've got that's one I want to specifically talk about in a minute or two here, and I'm curious as to if you have any thoughts on that one.
I honestly did not like Red Eye very much, which is disappointing because I like everybody that's in it. I like Cillian Murphy. I normally am, in awe of anytime Rachel McAdams is on my TV screen.
Yep.
Brian Cox is in it for a few minutes. He's sitting in a comfy chair for most of that movie.
Which is not a bad gig if you can get it.
Sure, why not? It didn't really do it for me. I won't say that it didn't feel like a Wes Craven movie. It just kind of felt like a subpar Wes Craven movie for me. It felt like, I give him credit for trying to do something different, something that's not straight out blood and gore or horror. He tried to do something more, and this is another instance where you can see a little bit of the Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick also influence in his style. He tried to do this sort of taut, thriller where it's just it's very intimate and it's basically two people sitting next to each other on an airplane. I guess it's the ending is where it all kind of fell apart for me, or maybe right around the time that Cillian Murphy got stabbed in the neck.
That's kind of the turning point, I think, which is sad because he actually gets this really cool kind of evil voice after he gets stabbed in the neck. But my issues with Red Eye and any of Wes's kind of lesser movies, I think, can be summed up with the following sentiment at the very least. They're usually interesting ideas that tend to fall down in the execution. Again, the flip side is there's probably and I'm not intimately familiar with his entire filmography, so I apologize if this is completely wrong, but some of the other stuff I've seen is kind of the reverse. It's not mediocre idea, but a rather common idea with spectacular execution that elevates it above similar fare.
I agree with that.
And as far as, again, Red Eye, Cillian Murphy, I liked the guy for a long time. Again, Red Eye, his stuff as the Crow in the Nolan Batman trilogy, in the Dark Knight trilogy is
Scarecrow.
Fun, and it's a credit to him that he's able to pull that off so well. Then I actually saw Peaky Blinders, the television series, and I am a fan of that man for life now. What he's able to do in that series is phenomenal, legitimately. And him squaring off with Sam Neill doing an Irish accent, there's nothing to go. There's no weakness to that series at the moment, I think. Although the upcoming one is going to see whether or not they're going to jump the shark. we haven't quite done it yet, but I think we're nudging up on it. So I'm worried about the next season. But other than that, it's been phenomenal. And again, with Red Eye, it's just an issue of execution. Again, the ending, I'm with you there. It just there's so much goodness. There's some really good tense sequences. There's some great interactions between Murphy and Rachel McAdams, and it kind of falls apart at the end, which is very sad because there's a lot of really good stuff that went into that movie.
I think we can also take this time to talk about the other movie that Wes Craven made in 2005.
Let's
avoid it, which was Cursed.
Yeah, I was.
Here's what I want to say about. Here's what I want to say about Cursed. Not a good movie. I don't blame Wes Craven for this movie. I think he was trying his damnedest. For those who don't know, this movie, Curse, was written by Kevin Williamson, who also wrote, I believe, at least the first Scream movie. I don't remember if he also wrote the second. Kevin Williamson was also a writer for Dawson's Creek. I don't remember if he created the show or not. I can't remember. I can't be bothered to remember. Kevin Williamson... Did he? Okay. Well, that explains a lot. Kevin Williamson is the type of writer where if you don't rein him in, his writing will run amok all over your movie. In the first Scream movie, Wes Craven kept him on a very tight leash, and all of the things, those things that actually work about the style that Kevin Williamson usually employs in his writing, the sort of, the teen snark, the endless pop culture references, the endless parade of pop culture references.
Can we just be grateful that Williamson and Whedon have never collaborated?
Yeah, but see, Whedon actually knows when to stop.
That's why I'm grateful they've never collaborated.
Yeah. Also, Whedon doesn't take crap from writers, so. But
also true.
Yeah. Scream was very much Wes Craven bringing out the best in Kevin Williamson, and them coming together for something that was interesting and well made and and for the most part well written and very well executed, and visually, which has never been a problem of Wes Craven's, visually interesting and visually arresting. Cursed was much more of a Kevin Williamson movie than it was a Wes Craven movie. This is what happens when a good director is forced to direct crappy material. They had all kinds of, they had a decent cast at their disposal. They had a lot of people in really weird. It
depends on how highly you feel about Jesse Eisenberg. And
not very, but I'm talking about I'm talking about a couple of other people. For whatever reason, they tried to pull the exact same thing with Shannon and Elizabeth at the beginning of the movie that they did with Drew Barrymore in Scream, and this time it didn't work at all. Where she was kind of heavily featured and she was kind of on the upswing career-wise, and then she ends up getting slaughtered by a werewolf in short fashion. I think she's on screen for maybe all of 5 to 10 minutes. It kind of goes downhill from there. It's unfortunate because I remember when this movie first came out in 2005, and it was, by that point I was well aware of who Wes Craven was and what he was about. And I hear Wes Craven's making a werewolf movie. Now, that is all you need to tell me to sell me on watching that movie. Wes Craven is going to make a werewolf movie. And personally, I don't think, I think with, some people probably argue with me, but, the last really great werewolf movie was both The Howling and American Werewolf in London. That was in 1981, and that statement still stands as my opinion to this day. I was hoping Curse was going to be was going to be up
The
there.
only thing I'd recommend that might challenge that is if you haven't seen Dog Soldiers and you don't mind Scottish accents, I'd say look that one up. That one I would place in that kind of pantheon.
I've heard. I've been meaning to see it. I hear 50-50 on Dog Soldiers. That's the only one that I've heard that anyone that even comes close to anybody praising as a werewolf movie on the level of, those two from '81. That was unfortunate, and I honestly don't want to end this show on a downer on a lesser Wes Craven movie, but I would have liked to see what a less Hollywood-ized Kevin Williamson might have come up with for Wes Craven to direct as far as this movie, or just somebody else entirely, because Wes Craven doing a werewolf movie was something that really, really appealed to me, and I was unfortunately pretty disappointed by it, and I don't blame him for that. It was just kind of unfortunate that the script kind of ate him.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. No, we're most certainly not going to end on a downer. There's a couple of things that I have that I'm really kind of hoping. Again, I like ending these things at least on a somewhat positive note, or at the very least a nostalgic or bittersweet one. And I've got something. Again, I have kind of my outro planned for this one, but there's something I want to touch on as far as Wes Craven's earlier stuff, and I mentioned, this leads into a slightly larger discussion that I'm going to have to curtail a bit, but I'm curious for your perspective, because I have mine as far as this goes, but Wes Craven made a few movies that have been remade, in no small part because they were very successful, but the two I want to focus on for this are The Hills Have Eyes and The Last House on the Left, which were two of his earlier movies. I believe The Last House on the Left was his first movie, and then The Hills Have Eyes was his second. That might be reversed. I'm going to double check that now, lest I look completely foolish. Last House on the Left was first, Hills Have Eyes was second. Okay. I feel less foolish now. And because my perspective on these movies, especially the remakes, first of all, the Hills Have Eyes remake is, hand on a stack of Bibles, one of the most laughably bad horror movies I've ever seen.
Aw, I actually like that movie.
and people see movies differently than I do. For me, there's one scene in this movie that just slapped me in the face and took me completely out of it. That's where one of the characters ambushes one of the inbred cannibals who's stalking them with a baseball bat. Inbred cannibal is carrying a shotgun. They render inbred cannibal unconscious, drop the bat, which they use to render them unconscious, and then leave a perfectly good loaded shotgun laying next to the temporarily unconscious cannibal. How do you not grab the shotgun before you leave that room?
It was symbolism. He was scared.
It's just one of those things that takes me out of movies when people act that. At the very least, he should have held on to the bat. All right, that's at the very least.
I thought it was weird. Like the only part, and this wasn't even an objectionable part of that remake. It was just something that I noticed that stood out to me like a sore thumb, just because. If you've seen the movie, this is gonna. I'm going somewhere with this, trust me. But if you've ever seen Tony Scott's movie True Romance, I don't know if have you seen that before, Robert?
I can't say that I have.
Can't recommend it enough. Written by Quentin Tarantino, cast to die for. It's a great, great, great movie. But aside from that, there's a scene, without giving too much away from that movie, because I legitimately don't want to spoil it because it's really good and everybody should watch it. There's a scene in that movie where the female lead played by Patricia Arquette is confronted by James Gandolfini, who is playing a mob guy, if you can believe it.
No.
He's good in the movie though. And there's this just brutal fight that knock down, drag out fight between the two of them, and there's a part where Patricia Arquette, beaten half to death, is threatening to stab James Gandolfini with a corkscrew, and he kind of like thinks it, he thinks it's funny, and he's kind of toying with her, and he basically says, I'm going to give you a free shot, do your worst, and she stabs him in the foot. If you remember the Hills Have Eyes remake, that scene plays out almost exactly the same way between whoever the guys that played the male lead and the gigantic mongoloid, 7 foot tall, monstrous mutant. That exact same scene plays out. I was laughing my ass off because all I could think of was that scene in True Romance. I don't know if that's intentional or not. I don't know if that was tribute. I don't know what that was about, but it made me laugh.
It seems, if your description is accurate, and I'll give you all kinds of credit for that, that seems way too direct to be incidental. So,
you remember that scene in the remake, though, right? Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Now go watch True Romance. You'll laugh at that too.
All right, I can always use a good laugh. I wanted to bring this up specifically referencing Last House on the Left, and I feel like a lot of the, and again, I don't want to have this huge discussion here because there is a long discussion about how Hollywood and those who try to make movies in the, forgive the phrase, torture porn genre have remade badly a bunch of exploitation movies from the 60s and 70s while completely, all they do is up the violence and gore and completely miss a lot of the point behind them, or the interesting character interactions and things along those lines. And with The Last House on the Left, I feel that was one of the more egregious examples because, and I have to pimp another documentary that I saw on Netflix. What was it? I think it was Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. It's maybe 2 hours long, just kind of a documentary about American-style horror movies. And, of course, they interviewed Wes Craven for this, and he talks about the original Last House on the Left. And having seen it, and listening to him talk about it, there's, again, and this is one of the things that I have to say as we're kind of winding down here, I have to get into this a little bit, that everything he does is very thoughtful by and large. And again, even forgiving the movies of his that are just kind of like, yeesh. And there are a few. He talks specifically about the use of violence in the famous scenes from the original Last House on the Left, the rape and murder of the daughter, and how there's a couple of scenes at the end of that sequence where the violent offenders are left shocked, a little bit dazed, and moderately horrified by what they've actually done. And the effect, you've just witnessed this horrific crime, and now these people are very much affected by this. These aren't mindless sociopaths. These are, again, they're disturbed people, clearly, but they're not unfeeling. And and he talks about how he kind of juxtaposed that with, at the end, after the parents of the murdered girl get revenge, and violently get revenge on this pack of delinquents, and that's not necessarily the correct word, but it'll do for the purposes of this discussion, that despite all of this violence that they've done, they're still left alone, without closure, and still without their daughter. And it's, when you listen to him talk about it, it's very much an interesting kind of thought process behind how senseless revenge violence really is. And it's that kind of thoughtfulness that he was able to put into all of his movies. And again, that attention to detail, the kind of thoughtfulness, the psychology behind what he did, I think that's one of kind of his lasting legacies as a filmmaker. Is, like you mentioned, he wasn't a guy who just tried to scare you by showing you stuff. Anybody can do that. He wanted to know why it scared you, and he didn't want to scare you in the theater. He wanted to scare you, 2 weeks later when you hear something go bump in the night. and again, that's kind of his. I feel one of his lasting legacies is thoughtful, intelligent filmmaking, no matter the subject material. And so I'll give you kind of the last word. Is there anything, any final thoughts on his legacy as a filmmaker, or what he's contributed to, especially again the horror genre where he kind of made his bread and butter? Anything final that you kind of want to say there before we wrap up and sign off?
In parting, I would say Wes Craven's lasting legacy as a filmmaker and as somebody who really grasped what horror was about and what it can do to a person and how it can affect people. Wes Craven, it seems, you look back at especially his earlier work, and you've got the Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left and leading up to Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven invaded your personal space. Wes Craven was not content to make you afraid of things that you knew realistically couldn't happen or that you couldn't relate to. He would turn those things on its head. Nightmare on Elm Street being the best example of that. But he invaded your personal space. He invaded places where you thought you'd be safe. With Last House on the Left, it was suburbia, and it was the idea of idyllic family life of that time, and he invaded that and he made that horrifying. Last House on the Left, it was about survival instinct and how far you could push a human being to survive against these terrifying circumstances. And of course, in Nightmare on Elm Street, he invaded your dreams. He invaded the one place where you would think that you would be safe. You'd be safe from any external threat. And he made that terrifying, and there was no going back from that. And he's on many occasions, I think he's specifically in Never Sleep Again, he said, that's kind of the most intimate violation, and the most egregious and the most horrifying violation is somebody that's able to violate you in your dreams, in your subconscious, in your mind. He was somebody that, like I said, he wanted to know what scared you and why, and he also wanted to experiment with what sacred places he could instill fear into. To a lesser extent, I guess you could say, Scream did that for, people's love of movies and the conventions of that. And he turned that on its ear, and now, suddenly you weren't, he was using all of these things that you had grown up to love, and now he was using it against you, and now you've got a killer who's basically living out a slasher movie. So he was very good at that. He was very good at taking something that you would never think could be terrifying and make it terrifying.
I agree. And again, I've mentioned this on many different podcasts, but whenever I kind of qualify and quantify horror movies, I go back to Stephen King's 3 basic tiers as far as what it aims to do that he laid down in his book, Danse Macabre. You have the highest level is terror, which extends beyond just what you watch. It gets into your brain and it scares you for days, weeks, months, years. You have horror, which is still scary, but is a bit more momentary. And then you have gross out effects, which is just designed to initiate a visceral reaction. And to his eternal credit, I think Wes Craven was able to do all 3 of those depending on what he wanted to do for any given movie or any given scene. And I have, because I don't want to close on a downer note, I have, this actually was somewhat inspired by you, Ben, because earlier this year, and we've mentioned, this year has sucked for losing high-profile people. We've lost a couple of very prominent wrestlers. actors, directors. Now it's been a rough year, but you mentioned that since we found out about Christopher Lee and Dusty Rhodes passing away on the same day, that you tended to think that Sir Christopher Lee was working on a metal version of Common Man for Dusty Rhodes. I'm a little bit. I need to mention this specifically here because I fantasy casted this just a little bit. To Bruce Campbell, sir, please be careful. Because we now have a horror master in Wes Craven, a true icon of horror in Christopher Lee, and a solid, I imagine what would be one half of an everyman kind of black comedic duo in Roddy Piper up there. And if I'm fantasy casting a genre movie that deals with, supreme evil and the everymen who fight it, you've got Christopher Lee as the supreme evil, and you've got Roddy Piper and Bruce Campbell as your kind of wisecracking everymen fighting it. So, Bruce Campbell, please, look both ways before crossing the street.
I had to mute my mic. I had to mute my mic a minute there because I was marking out for that. That was pretty good. Well played, sir.
All right, and again, thankfully, on that note, and I really regret that we're never going to actually see that movie because, and again, I haven't written it, theoretically, even in my own head, but that would be all kinds of awesome. On that note, I think we're going to wrap up shop here. Ben, anything you want to plug before I'm going to play Dawkins again, and we're going to go out to that. So, anything you want to plug? Anything you need to get out of the way?
A couple of things real quick. As you said before, I, as always as ever, I write, draw, self-publish a comic called Soul Exodus, which I will actually be exhibiting at New York Comic Con next month, October 8th through 11th. It's a hard ticket to get. It's a hard place to get into. But if you happen to be, one of the chosen few who's able to attend, check me out at New York Comic Con, and you can check out my website, soulexo.com, facebook.com/soulexo, Twitter at soulexocomic for information about where I'll be in the convention center. To extend that, I have actually also just finished working on my part for Louis Lovehog, a.k.a. Linkara, and his Atop the Fourth Wall movie, which should be out possibly in the month of October, if all goes well, fingers crossed. I actually wrote and drew a 10-page comic, which will be in some way featured in the Atop the Fourth Wall movie, and the good news is, and I'm announcing it here first, I am going to have copies, some limited copies to sell at New York Comic Con. So I'm very excited about that. I'm very excited to see, what people think of the comic, and it was a blast working with Louis. So check out his website as well at topthefourthwall.com.
All right, real briefly for my part, this coming Saturday, I will have live coverage of UFC 191 over at 411mania.com in the MMA section. Should be a good card. Probably my favorite active fighter, Demetrius Johnson, flyweight champion, is going to defend the belt. In that same vein, because I always write about Demetrius Johnson before he fights, I haven't written a standalone piece for quite a while. I don't know exactly why. I imagine part of it's I've spent the last little bit helping my dad move. I've not been inspired, and that's a weak excuse. I'm very well aware of that. If you're serious about writing or any art form, inspiration is a benefit. It's a fringe benefit, not the golden. It's not what you need. It's a nice benefit. But I will have something up about Demetrius Johnson and the impressive run he's been on. How he's closing in on some pretty substantial milestones from for those of you who are fans of statistics. He's got some big ones coming up, especially if he beats John Dodson, and my prediction is that he will, so take that for what it's worth. As well, you can find me every Sunday hosting the 411 Ground and Pound radio show. This Sunday we'll be reviewing UFC 191. I think we're taking the week after that off. There's only a couple of UFC events. this entire month, and that's what we're primarily focused on. So, but again, if major news breaks or something like that, then that will be the normal time for the show. More updates as they become available. I've still got to hash out the exact schedule for this month. And every Friday you can find me, well, most Fridays, I can't say every Friday anymore, you can find me hosting my podcast here on the Red Legend Broadcasting Network, Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. I will have something this week. I might do a specific retrospective on Wes Craven's career. Something along those lines if nothing else speaks to me, so be on the lookout for that. It goes live Fridays at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All right, Ben, thank you for being here, because one guy just yakking to himself for 60 minutes is exponentially less interesting than sharing a conversation. And on that note, we're done here. So we're going out to Dawkins again. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Hopefully it'll be a while before we have to do one of these somewhat, retrospectives of people who have passed away. So everyone out there, we say it here when we sign off, but please be well, be safe, and behave.
Sweet dreams.